Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Yeah, before we start, can I just ask everyone to make sure that you're muted, just because otherwise I end up with an echo, and the echo will throw me off my story a bit. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here at this very first, if I understand correctly, crash course. It's super good to meet you all, and those of you who I know already, good to see you all here. I'm going to give a presentation about the weird collision that kind of happens between business and art in our medium, and some ways to navigate that. I know that is a complicated thing. I know that it is more difficult to deal with if you're not in one of the major development cities around the world. So I want to talk a bit about all of those things. I'm going to leave quite a bit of time to do the Q&A at the end of the talk. So from what I understand, there is a crash course chat that you can be in near this channel. If you have any questions, feel free to just type them there, even during the presentation. I'll try and keep an eye on them and answer any that you might come across. With most presentations, I try to have a gimmick. For this one, the gimmick is that I try to use the word under as frequently as possible, because I ended up with the first two words I wrote were both like under something. So I just had to make everything under. So it might be a little awkward because I'll have to work my way through that. But, I like having some fun with my presentations. So let's see if all of this works. You should see PowerPoint. And I hope it works. Does that work? Can somebody in the crash course chat let me know if that is streaming properly?
You have to click something on the top left. I see a screen, but I don't see a PowerPoint, I guess.
See a screen, but not a PowerPoint. Do you see a logo? Green logo?
Yes.
Yeah, we see the green logo.
Okay, so if I do this, does it update?
It says business dev development.
All right. Well, as long as you see the slides, I guess it's kind of working. Let me see if my camera works today. Had some issues earlier today, so that's going to be fun. Actually, seems to work right now. Stuff is very green around here. Hi. Okay, so if everything's okay, presentation, me. Still working?
I'm seeing it. Yeah.
Awesome. Good. So I'll try to make sure that it's also easy to follow if you can't see the presentation, but yeah, we'll just get going. We'll see how this goes. So we are going to be talking about business development, BizDev, as they call it, and we're going to talk about how to develop your business development skills. The main idea of this talk is to really kind of hone in on things you can do with relatively few resources to still get ahead in making video games. This mostly applies to people doing commercial work, but obviously, even if you're doing freeware work or hobbyist work, I presume you're making games because you want people to play them, right? So even if your work is free, my first few games were free. A lot of these things still apply to you, no matter whether you're making games for the art or you're making games for commerce, or you're doing it as a hobby or you're doing it as a professional. Like, all of these things kind of apply to games, because games exist in that weird space between art and technology and business, right? So just a real quick introduction for those of you who do not know me. My name is Rami Ismail. I am a game developer, an independent game developer. I was formerly half of a Dutch independent game studio called Vlambeer. We are best known for games like Ridiculous Fishing, Nuclear Throne, lift trousers, and Super Crate Box. I also create tools for independent developers that they can use. I've been involved in Do Toolkit and the projects that exist under that, including Do Press Kit, which is sort of an industry standard press tool. I was also involved in several initiatives around the industry to make things that were not accessible at the time as accessible as possible. So you might know me from work at things like Indie Mega Booth, which I helped create early on, Indie Fund, where I'm a partner, and Game.Dev World, which is a free online conference translated across the 8 major languages of the world, just so that anybody can speak, anybody can follow. I also help out the IGDA and a lot of their mentorship programs, and I'm a consultant for developers around the world. That's kind of what I do. Most of my year, I travel around the world, going to places, meeting developers, talking about their problems, learning from them, seeing the opportunities in their cultures and in their lives, seeing the obstacles in their cultures and in their lives. So that's me. If you know me from Twitter, I apologize. I tweet too much. That said, I think the best thing to do right now is to make sure we just get going. So, art and business, right? Games exist in this weird space, right? Where on the one side, we are making an artistic product, right? We're trying to make something creative. And part of the beauty of art is that it is sincere, right? It is something that we create because we wish for it to exist more than that we actually believe there is monetary value or monetary gain in the creation of that specific thing. That said, games are also really hard to make, right? Like if you think about art from the perspective of a photographer or a writer, like the investment in that in terms of skill is still relatively high, right? But if I wanted to take a good photo, I could kind of just take this phone and point it at something, and it has this amazing portrait mode, and it comes out as a beautiful soft focus photograph with basically no skill on my behalf, right? Games are incredibly complex, and because they are incredibly complex, they take time, they take effort, they take people and expertise to create. And because games take that many resources to create, they say time is money, and that applies here. Like the amount of investment you need to put into a game for it to actually work is high enough that most games end up being created sort of on that line between art and business, where on the one side, the people creating it really want it to exist, but on the other side, they understand that you have to earn money somehow, right? Like you have to be able to sustain yourself somehow. Obviously, some people create these games just with the goal of making one game. I assume if you're here, you're taking this seriously enough that you're not trying to make a game, you're trying to make games, right? You're not trying to just get one game out of the door. You're hoping that after that game, you'll have the opportunity to create a next one, a better one. You see this as a craft. You see this as being a craftsperson that develops their craft over time. So, oh, somebody is not muted. Can we just get that? Otherwise, the echo gets pretty intense on my end for some reason. Okay, well. So yeah, that's where games exist, somewhere between art and business, right? So when we talk about BizDev, when we talk about business development, we're really talking about two different things, right? And sure, like a lot of people use it as business development as one phrase, right? Like the act of increasing your business, of developing your business opportunities. And that is what business development is. I actually like BizDev as a term more for its two separate parts. I think that is more interesting. So we're going to talk about BizDev, And for the dev part, we're going to talk about production and development. We're going to talk about how do you take a game and turn it into something that is a product, right? That is still the thing you want to make, still the thing you care for, but also is something that will stand the trials of the market, right? So, to begin, a product, right? A word some people love, some people hate. The most important thing is when your game goes into the market, sure, it's still a game, but it has to become a product. And a product is effectively a value proposition, right? You say to a potential buyer, I have a thing. This thing will bring you joy. It'll bring you happiness. It'll bring you fun. It'll bring you insight or perspective. And you're going to give me money for it, or you're going to give me your time for it, right? Don't forget, it's not just money. It's money and time that people are investing. To make sure that that goes as well as possible, we end up having to create a way of communicating that value, right? This becomes a critical concept in pretty much everything we do, from publishing to making our store page. A lot of it is purely about communicating. So the biggest challenges I see, the biggest mistakes I see when people are making games are actually quite simple. It's undervaluing and underselling, right? So let's start with undervaluing. When I was just starting out as a game developer, Flash games were still a huge thing, right? And Flash games were such a big thing that these websites, board.com and a bunch of others, would go to developers that were interesting, doing interesting work in the Flash space, and they would pay for their games and then put those games on their website and just like plaster them with ads. And then high school kids would go in and play those games, right? This is before iOS was really a thing. This is when indie as a thing was relatively new, probably around 2010-ish. And we made a game, me and my co-founder at Vlambeer. We had just started our studio, and we made a game because we needed money. So we made a Flash game, and we made a Flash game about fishing. And it was called Radical Fishing. And we sold it after negotiating pretty hard. We sold it for $10,001, which for us was huge. Like $10,000 for a video game. Like we were just starting. We loved it. We were extremely happy. And then that game actually ended up reaching a lot of people. A lot of people played Radical Fishing, and it even reached this guy that worked at Adult Swim. And Adult Swim is part of the same brand as Cartoon Network, huge corporation. And they reached out to us and they said, "So can you make us a game?" And we said, "Yeah, if you pay for it, we'll make you a game, absolutely." And they said, "Well, how much do you think?" And me and my co-founder, we sat down and we discussed this, and we said, "Well, we asked for $10,000. This one is worth this is a huge company, so they can pay way more, right? Like we should ask for like twice as much." And then we got a little overconfident, and we went back and we said, "Okay, we want $30,000, right? 3 times as much." And the guy at Adult Swim looked at us and just went like, "Yeah, okay." And that's how we knew we messed up. Because in good negotiations, if the other person just was like, "Yeah, no, okay," then clearly you didn't go high enough, right? So a friend of mine also ended up getting approached by Adult Swim, and I told him the same story, and he said, "Well, you know what? We're going to ask for way more. We're going to ask for double that." So he went to them, and he said 60K, and the guy looked at him and said, "Yeah, it's fine." A few years ago, this guy left Adult Swim, and I've been stuck with that story for like 5 or 6 years. So when he left, I went to him and I said, "Okay, I don't know if you can talk about this, right? How much were you funding Flash games for back in the day?" And he said, "Oh, $250,000, something like that." And I was like, excuse me, $250,000? He's like, yeah. I'm like, how did you, like, why did you, like, couldn't you have just, like, told us? Like, he's like, no, my the number as low as possible. If you make a Flash game for us for 30K, means I have 220K of extra budget for the people that do negotiate. And that's how I learned not to undervalue my games, right? Value is strange that it has two sides. It's not just what something costs to make; it's also what something will pay, what somebody will pay for it, right? And when you talk about these games, when you talk to a publisher, when you're setting your price, keep in mind that it's not just about how much it costs to make; it's about how much is fair to ask for what you made, right? And it's not necessarily a calculation of how much time you spend on a game or how many people worked on a game. It is 100% a function of, will somebody pay this for it? So value is this weird thing, but a lot of indies, when they value their work, they take shortcuts, right? They try to get that number as low as possible. When they're doing a Kickstarter, they try to get the number low as possible. And I don't understand why they do that, because if you need $20,000 to make a thing, you go like, oh, but people are never going to fund it for 20,000. We should ask for, like, no, we should do 10,000 and then hope that we get enough. And then you hit 10,000, and I have to make it because there's people that paid for it, and you're $10,000 short because you needed 20,000. Like, that's not a way of making games, right? Same thing with publishers. When people undervalue their work or ask for bad rev share or whatever it is, like, you can value your own work. The biggest mistake I see is when people are budgeting, though, that they don't include themselves. They'll budget for their artist, their budget for their programmer. They'll never budget for themselves. And they go like, oh, I run the company. Like, yeah, you run the company. So if you can't afford to continue anymore, company is done. So no, you include yourself in that salary, and you pay a full salary when you're budgeting. Like, sure, if you're running the company, if you're bootstrapping it, if you're paying out of your own pocket, it's fine, right? But if you're talking to a publisher, if you're talking to a funder, no. Like, get your budget as high as possible. Add extra money on it, like 30% on top of it. Let's go. It's fine. Now, the second thing, and this is very dependent on who you are as a person. It's very dependent on cultural background. It's very dependent on how you think. It's underselling, right? If you're making something and you believe in it, you have to sell it like you believe in it. And a lot of people have this tendency to try to make their work small. And they do it because they're nervous. They do it because if you promise somebody something great and then they look at it and like, that hurts, right? Because you care about this game. But the solution is not to go like, it's pretty good, I think. And I see that all around the world. People say like, oh, we're working on a little thing, or oh yeah, it's I'm pretty happy with it. Like, no, just if you're making a game, you can just be proud of it, right? Even if you see the issues, that's fine. You see the issues. You're the developer, but your audience doesn't, right? The amount of things I see in the games that I've made in Nuclear Throne and Ridiculous Fishing, where I'm like, oh, that could have been so much better. But it doesn't matter, because the people playing it don't know that. They just see the game and they think, oh, this is good, right? Same is true for selling your game. If you're going to sell your game, you don't have to sell all the problems that come with it. You don't have to sell all the issues that you still have to fix. You have to sell the dream. You have to sell the promise of it. So when you're talking to a publisher, a funder, the audience, right? I'm not telling you to like lie or leave out important details. I'm telling you that it's okay to be proud of your work, and that it's okay to care about your game, and to make sure that when people see it, when people interact with it, when people see the store page, when people see the pitch, that they come out of that pitch believing the same thing you believe, which is that this is worth spending a year or 2 years of your life on. A lot of people, when they've worked in games for a bit, they stop looking at games in terms of money, right? They stop looking at games in terms of like, can I get enough money to make it? They end up looking at games at how much time does it take to make this, and how many games can I make with the time I have? By all means and standards, right? Assuming a game takes about 2 years to make, 2 to 3 years, I have maybe like 10 to 20 games left in me before I'm 60, right? That's ridiculous. That's not a lot of games. So when you are pitching this game, you can communicate that you believe this is worth one of those games that you have space for in your life. So try to avoid underselling, right? Like it's a huge risk. It's a risk that everybody that comes into games deals with, and dependent on who you are and like how loud you are, how humble you are. This can be hard, but um, it's not a bad thing to care about your work publicly, right? Okay, so let's talk about. I flipped these around. Let's talk about the development of games, right? Let's talk about the production of games, because this is another thing. Making a game is one challenge, right? Making a game well is a second challenge. Making a game well while managing a team, now that is the biggest challenge. It turns out, when I sit with my phone, that I can just point it at something and make a nice photo. It turns out games, we're not quite there yet, but they're not that dissimilar. Everybody that downloads Game Maker or downloads Unity or downloads Unreal, if they sit down and they spend a week, they can make a game. Won't be a good game, probably, right? But it'll be a video game. If you download Bitsy, you download Stencil, you download any of those tools, you can get to work right away. You can make a Twine game in no time, right? And those are all actual, real games. Now, it takes years of experience for most people to become better at making games. I started making games when I was 6, and it took me until I was 20 before I made the first one that maybe I was 16. Before I made the first one that didn't embarrass me when people talked about it, right? Where I didn't look at it and went like, oh, but it's bad, right? And part of that is just, I think it's an Ira Glass quote, but like the thing that gets you interested in something is that you have good taste in it, right? You play games and you go, oh, this is good. Oh, this is interesting. I love this. And then when you start making it, first thing you realize is that your work isn't that good, right? I have a piano in the house. I've been practicing for 3 years, 4 years. And every time I play anything, I know it's not that good. I just know it's not that good, and it's annoying. It hurts. But like, you keep practicing because one day maybe I'll play something and I'll be proud of it, right? Now, the same is true for games. Managing a team is a completely different skill set, and you start learning that as soon as you're good enough to make games to get other people to believe in it, which is where I assume quite a few of the audience is probably at in their career. Correct me if I'm wrong. Obviously, correct me in chat. But that's where I assume a lot of people are. On top of that, there's a second skill, a secret skill, basically, that people don't talk about much. That is much harder than making a game, that you still have to learn, which is releasing a game. Completely separate thing, completely separate skill set. So let's go through some development things that you can take and apply to your work to make sure that you have a better chance making games that are good, making games that'll work in the market, right? So the risks are pretty big. The first risk that a lot of people run into is that they underdefine, right? They don't understand per se what they're making. The way I've always been taught this is very simple. You draw 4 circles. Start with a small one, bigger one, bigger one, bigger one. And in the center, in the core, goes the hook, the gimmick, the nugget, whatever you want to call it, the thing that makes your game tick. And the thing is, a lot of people don't actually know what that thing is. They just start making a game. They're like, oh, we start from the story, we start with a platformer, we start with whatever it is, right? But they never define why that platformer is interesting or why that story is interesting. No, your core, your nugget, it needs to be something defined. It needs to be something specific, right? Ridiculous Fishing, our fishing game, was a game about continuous positive feedback. That was the important thing. Sure, it started from us watching a documentary about overfishing while talking about duck hunt, right? But the heart of it was that no matter how bad you are, if you just kind of like slap your phone into your face, you still needed to get points and progress. That was the heart of ridiculous fishing. We could define it as the deeper into the water you get, the more fish you can catch on the way back up. The more fish you catch on the way back up, the more fish you can shoot after you fling them in the air. The more fish that you shoot in the air, the more money you make. The more money you make, the more tools you can buy to get deeper into the water. Right? It's a loop. That's how well defined ridiculous fishing was. That loop was the heart of the game. Now around that loop, around that first circle, you draw your mechanics. So that second circle is your mechanics, and your mechanics are anything the player can use to play along with the rules of the game. What is and what isn't a mechanic? It goes a little outside of the scope of the stock. But let's just agree, mechanic. One of the things that I always felt really is really helpful is separating mechanics from pacing, though. No matter what game you're making, you usually have an activity that... Oh, I think it dropped. Hello?
I can hear you now, but I can't see your screen.
Okay, yeah, no, I think it dropped for a second. Well, go live. Are we back? I think we're back.
Yes, I can see you.
Awesome. Okay. So you have this separation of pacing and mechanics, right? That's where I was at. Yeah. So in a platformer, the easiest way to think about this is your mechanics are your jumps, right? The things you're interacting with. You're jumping, you're wall jumping. Your walking is spacing. It's giving you time to move between these challenges, giving you a bit of a cooldown, right? In a shooter, the shooting, the gunfights, that's mechanics. The walking between those, that's spacing, right? I always found that very helpful. I don't know if it necessarily helps in every game that you make, but it's good to think of things as like, what are active things the player is doing, interacting with the rule set of your game, and what are things that are mostly there as spacing, to give them space to breathe, to give them space to think, to give them space to consider things. Now, under defining that core creates a problem, because when you draw that second circle, you should be able to just write your mechanics in it, right? And then when you write your mechanics in it, you should be able to kind of mentally or physically, I don't really care which one, draw an arrow from the mechanic to the core. Every mechanic should point back at that core. Every mechanic should support that core. And if you're drawing that mental arrow and you can't make it work, it doesn't point back at the core. The one exception you can get away with is if that mechanic points at another mechanic, right? A lot of mechanics in games are actually just plumbing. They're just support for other mechanics that broke the design, right? You created something that is so powerful that if you have it, it's too good. So now you add an ammo, like a weapon, for example. So now you add an ammo mechanic that you didn't have before, but I guess you need an ammo mechanic. Otherwise, people just keep shooting the very powerful thing. Or you add that you can jump in the air. Now you have to add a mechanic that keeps track of how often you've jumped in the air, because a double jump, yeah, that's still reasonable, but a triple jump, well, might break your design, right? So a lot of mechanics kind of point at each other to keep track, to limit how much impact they can have on the design. That's fine. That's the one exception you get away with. If your mechanic points at another mechanic, fine. If your mechanic points outwards, though, that's a problem. And the best solution for that is to just get rid of it. The third circle is your declarative layer. It's the part that communicates to the player. This is also outside of the scope of our talk, but just so you have the full model. So you have core, mechanics, narrative, and for declarative. And declarative is your graphics, your audio, your haptic feedback, your story, your text, your numbers. Is hitting somebody worth 1 damage, or is hitting somebody worth 10,000 damage. What different feeling does that create? That's your declarative layer. Technically, it's doing the same thing, but the way you declare it to the player has a huge part in how it actually ends up feeling in the player's mind. The final circle, the outside circle, I call that the meta circle. Your menu, your marketing, everything that the player brings into the experience. Every arrow should point to another point in the same circle or at another point in a circle that's deeper in. So your meta should always point at your declarative layer, your mechanics, or your core. Your declarative layer should always point at your mechanics or your core. Your mechanics should always point at a mechanic or the core. As long as you keep that, you're making a pretty elegant game, right? You're making something that's coherent. You're making something that's defined. But the most critical thing is that you know what's in the center, right? That it's defined, that you know why you're making that thing. So don't cheap out on figuring out that one, right? You can spend a lot of time figuring out that one, because as soon as you have that answer, it's like putting a puzzle in place, right? As soon as you have a few pieces in place, you can start working on the puzzle. But as long as it's just all random pieces, you can look at it for hours. You won't solve it, right? You need to start putting pieces down. That under definition kills a lot of projects, right? People don't agree on what they're making, and they don't find out until much later. So define your work quickly. Define your work before you really get going on production. Now, the second step is you have an idea. The problem with ideas is that our brain is really good at figuring out stuff, right? Our brain is really good at filling in the blanks. I always use this example of, imagine a dragon in a castle, and the castle is floating on the clouds, and in the castle is a warrior, and the warrior is fighting the dragon, right? Let's say with a sword, right? Now, every time I added something, your brain is quite capable of just filling in those details, right? So if I ask you, what color brick is the castle? Because I'm asking you in this context, you might go like, well, I don't know, right? Like it's a test. It's not a test. Just for yourself, like search within yourself, what color brick is the castle? What color is the dragon? How big is the dragon, right? What kind of warrior is it? Is it a knight? Is it a... Hello? Do I exist?
Welcome back.
Yes.
Nice. Okay. Okay, let's see. Good. All right, the color of the castle. That's where I was at, right? Okay. So our brain, let's just continue from this point, because I think the point is clear. Like, your brain fills in all these details. Your computer does not, right? When people talk about game ideas, the biggest mistakes a lot of developers make, and this is not just aspiring developers, this is developers on all levels of the industry, is they forget that translating from a brain to a computer, they're completely different interfaces. They're completely different ways of ideas, right? A computer is literal. It's actually not that smart a device. It does exactly what you tell it to and nothing more. So if you say castle, it asks, what is it? And you say, well, it's a building made out of bricks. It goes, what's a building? What's a brick, right? So a lot of things that seem cool in your mind, like, oh, you walk to this giant building in the distance and it just gets like larger and larger and it's very far away. Like that sounds real cool. There's a reason in movies that we cut from very far away to basically inside the castle, right? Because it turns out it's boring. It's not interesting. Validating your ideas is huge. And the best way to do it is by just making the cheapest possible prototype you can make, right? Just the fastest, the worst, the most broken thing you can make. At Vlambeer, our prototypes look like, not great. MS Paint drawings, if even. Things bouncing around the screen. Code was awful. But you know what? Helped us test what we thought, and that's good enough, right? So when you're having these ideas, when you're thinking about your game, like make sure that you validate every idea that you have, that you test whether it works and then figure out where it doesn't work. I used the plumber metaphor before, but that is really what game design is, right? Like making games is plumbing. You come up with something, you test it, you figure out where it's leaking, you patch the leak, you realize now there's too much water pressure. Okay, let's fix that other leak, right? There's too much water coming through. Let's add like a bathtub somewhere. There's not enough water coming through. Okay, let's connect it to the ocean, right? Like game design is plumbing. You create solutions to problems. Those create new problems, and you make solutions for those problems until eventually the problems have become so small, or it balances out so well that it's good enough, right? Validating is a huge part of that, and validating can only be done by prototyping. It can only be done, and you don't have to be a programmer to prototype, right? You can prototype on paper, you can prototype on your computer, you can prototype by faking it in PowerPoint. You can prototype. I'm prototyping a card game right now in Excel. I haven't made a single card yet, right? It's just Excel at the moment, and there's a field that rolls a random number, and that number is the card I'm drawing. Like that's how simple it is. If I've already drawn it, I'll roll it again. That way, I'm testing the card game, and it works, right? Like that's how cheap your prototyping has to be. Now, after you've got that done, communicating your game becomes the biggest challenge because you're probably not working alone. And if you're not working alone, making sure that everybody understands what you're working on is a huge challenge. It's a challenge that a lot of people underestimate. When they underestimate this challenge, the biggest thing, and this is one of my favorite stories that ever happened, was I was working with a team and they were having trouble. They were having trouble getting on one line, right? They were having a lot of disagreements, and they couldn't figure it out. And they'd been working on the game for like 2 or 3 months when they called me and they said, "Rami, we need some help. We can't get out of this. Like, like every time we talk, like we go into prototyping for like 2, 3 weeks, and then it's not right. Like it's wrong. Like what comes out is wrong." So I sat down with everybody, and I just asked them, like, "Okay, what do you think you're making? Right? Like, what is it?" And they would start talking about it. And after a bit of communication, after a bit of talking about it, I asked them to do four basic exercises. The first one is draw a screenshot on paper. Just draw it. It doesn't have to be a good drawing, right? Like I'm an awful drawer. The first one was draw a screenshot. The second one is write down the most important thing the player does in the game. The third one is what kind of music do you imagine with the game, right? And the final one was how long do you think development is going to take? And when we put all those things together and we put them in front of the team, we realized that half of the team was prototyping this from the idea of it being sort of like a turn-based game, like top-down, relatively slow. And the other half was just straight up working on an action game that was third person, but they were thinking that the prototype was top-down because that was faster prototyping. Turned out nobody had drawn what the game would look like. So for communication, the biggest tip I have is try to communicate with people in their own discipline, right? So if you're talking to an artist, draw it for them. If you're talking to a musician, hum it for them, right? I'm tone deaf. Like I'm the most tone deaf person you will ever meet. Like I can't tell any note apart from each other. But I'll hum if it helps the composer. Like if they're listening to the song and it was like da 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 like, you know, that last there's a note there that does like the tempo isn't like, you know, and I'm sure that was awful. I can't even tell if it was awful, but communicate. If I talk to a sound designer, I don't go like, oh, the explosion needs more rumble. I go like, oh, the explosion is a little like, and I kind of want like, can you get that for me? Talk to a programmer. Usually I'm the programmer, but if I'm talking to other programmers, very often I'll just do like a little drawing of like a flow chart. Like, this is how I imagine this to work. This is what I imagine the function does. And if I'm talking to designer, flowcharts, you know, a little design docs, little piece of writing usually help a lot. But communicating, getting people pointed in one direction is really hard, right? And part of that turns into motivation. And motivation is probably, if you're leading a team, if you're in a team, if you're leading a team, if you're a creative, motivation is the most valuable thing you have. Like, people say like money, people say like knowledge, like no. Motivation is the thing that matters. The reason motivation matters is if you have all the money, all the knowledge in the world, but you're not motivated, you ain't making that video game, right? It just ain't happening. So how do you keep your team motivated? Well, agency is a huge part of it. Letting people feel like they have the freedom to add something of their own to the game. It sounds like a compromise, right? It sounds like contradiction. Somebody has to be in charge of the game, but the reality is, if you communicate well, then everybody has already bought in. Everybody's already into this game. Everybody's already like excited to work on it. And even if they have some hesitations, they're convinced enough that they'll go through with it, right? So when you're working on a game like that, keeping your team motivated becomes a huge part of actually running a team, of actually keeping your team going. And that involves good talking. It involves making sure that people are not overworked, and it involves making sure that people know what their task is, what their deadline is, what the context is. I'm consulting on a team right now, and one of the biggest problems they have is that the person in charge of that team is relatively new to leading teams. And he had an issue where the programmer he hired, who's a really good programmer, ended up spending like 8.5 hours on a really simple prototype that really should have taken like 1 or 2 hours. And this programmer is paid by the hour, right? Like a freelancer. So 8 hours was way too much for that, and it's cutting into the prototyping budget. So and the prototype was not that useful either. It had like beautiful like a character, fully animated character, and like all these cool effects. So we went to the program. We said like, well, why did you spend all that time on making the character? He's like, oh, I didn't make the character. I bought it from the assets store. It just took some time to get it implemented. We're like, okay, but why did you? We don't need a character. It can just literally be a capsule. And he said like, well, you know, you can't judge code really. So I wanted to show that I write good code. So I just wanted to spruce it up a little. And the thing is, that's valid because apparently there was never the context of the assignment that it needed to be a quick and dirty prototype, right? Communicating that sort of stuff helps because now the programmer was worried about how he was going to be judged, which creates tension, right? And the programmer is now worried that he overbills, which he does, but you know, like that shouldn't have been a problem because the context should have been clear. Motivation is very fragile. It is extremely fragile in people. Like one time of treating somebody like poorly at a moment where they really can't handle it or really can't use it is enough to fracture motivation in people. One toxic person in your group, in your project, can tank an entire game. It has tanked entire games, and it will tank more games. One person getting overworked when they are working on important stuff is enough to tank your game. So keep motivation in mind, keep health in mind. It is more important to game design than a lot of people think. And finally, underestimating all of the before. It is so easy to look at things and go, oh, we can figure that out. We'll figure it out when we get there, right? That's not how it works. The best teams, the teams that have the most opportunity in our industry with their work, are teams that get these earlier things right. And that's not always a natural thing, right? It's not always something that they just have. It's not a talent. It's not born to them. No, of course, like a lot of people that are successful in the industry have a ton of privilege. Like, don't get me wrong, absolutely. But even the people with privilege, right? If they can't get the things before this right, they have to be really, really privileged to still stand a chance in our industry. Because all of the things before create a good game that you can sell. Right? And then on top of that comes all the other stuff. On top of the marketing. But you know what? Marketing, if you can communicate your game well within the team, you can communicate your game well outside of the team as well, because you know what it's about. Right? So people worry about marketing. If you figure this stuff out, you don't have to worry about marketing. Sure, you might worry about the shape of it. Like, when do I start? Do I spend money? What events do I go to? I mean, that's not a thing right now, but do I do influencers? Do I do press? Like, those are all valid questions. But if you know how to communicate, you've already done 90% of it, because that's the important part. It doesn't matter who you send it to if the message is not good, right? If the game is not interesting. With budgeting, not undervaluing yourself, keep making sure that your team is motivated. Now you have a better budget because you can figure out what you need, what time people need to recover, what time people need to stay motivated. You don't undervalue yourself, you don't undersell yourself, so you know exactly how much money you need. Everything in games becomes easier if you figure out the things I talked about before, right? I'll run through them one more time just to go real quick. So don't undervalue your work. Your work is valuable. Your work is valuable, not just the end of what you've made. When you're budgeting, include yourself. But the value of your work is not just the cost of making it. The beauty of making art, the beauty of making things like this is that the end result is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So don't just have the budget and that's the value. No, if you have a cool IP, if you have an interesting game, if you've worked on something before and you talk to a publisher, you're pitching a budget to them, you can include the value of that in the budget, in the pitch. Don't undersell your work. You don't have to be humble. Like, well, let me get that right. You have to be humble. You don't have to like undersell it. There's a difference between being humble and just selling yourself short, right? When you work on a game, define it well, especially define the heart of it, define the core, define the part that matters. It's different for every game. So this is really up to you, but you have to get this right. And then make sure that for every part of the game that is important, that you're validating it, that you're checking it, that you're testing it, that you're playtesting it. Vlambeer games, we started playtesting weeks into development. The card game I'm talking about, I've playtested it with a bunch of people, and this thing is like 3 weeks old, right? Validate your assumptions, validate everything that you think that you know. Just test it, make sure that it's right, make sure that it's correct. Don't steal from other games. Don't copy, don't just go like, oh, it'll work. Don't say things like, oh, we'll figure it out, or it'll be intuitive. Like, all of that means nothing until you test it. And when you communicate, try to communicate in the language of the people you're speaking to. And I don't mean literal language, I mean the discipline, the expertise. Try to meet them in the middle so that the things you're saying, the things you're trying to say, communicate as clearly as possible. Within your team, within yourself as a creative, motivation is really hard, right? Seeing a negative tweet, seeing a negative YouTube comment, not feeling like your work is good enough, not feeling like your work fits in, not knowing what you have to do. All of these things bring down motivation. And motivation is extremely fragile. It's really hard to get back up. So if there is anything you should focus on when managing a team, motivate people, keep them excited, keep them healthy, keep them happy. More than anything, that matters. That's how you make good video games. And take all of these things seriously. These are not things that you just do. These are things that take practice. These are things that take time. These are things that are different for every studio. I can't tell you the solution for these things for your studio because the people that are in it are different. The context that you're working in is different. The resource that you have are different. Don't underestimate this. Get going on this. Like, figure it out. Start talking. And the biggest way to avoid this is really just to learn to aim to understand. And understand in an experience-based industry means talking to people, it means reaching out to people, it means talking to people that might have more experience in the specific thing you're trying to fix, right? Now, here's the thing. A lot of you might not feel like you have access to this knowledge, right? Or that it's outside of the country, it's outside of your reach. It's people with more experience have it, right? And I come across that everywhere I go around the world. And the honest reality is, when I started, I was a Dutch Egyptian kid from the Netherlands. Nobody cared about the Netherlands, right? And I just started asking people. I just started emailing people. And when people email me, every time I try to answer. In fact, on my Twitter profile, if you look at the pinned tweet, the top one is just a way to have a phone call with me for 20 minutes. If you want to do that, by the way, just, do it. I'd love to see what y'all are working on. A lot of people in the industry took a lot when they joined, right? They took knowledge, they took people's time, they took people's attention, they took people's expertise, and they take it and it is given to them, because the hope is that after they grow, after they get their own understanding, after they figure things out for themselves, they figure out what works for them, what doesn't work for them. The hope is that they will give, right? And they will give more than they take. And you know what? In my 10, 12, 12 years in the industry right now, it's always been true. Like, yeah, there's a bunch of, not great people. But in general, people will give because people have taken, right? And if you are ever stuck, don't be afraid to take. Don't be afraid to ask people. Don't be afraid to ask me. Don't be afraid to ask anybody in your community that might have these contacts, right? As people make more games, the collective knowledge around you increases through things like the society here. So keep making stuff, keep talking to each other, right? Your community ends up being one of your most powerful tools in making these games, because that's where the contacts are. That's where opportunity ends up being. So aim to understand, and if you do not, don't worry about asking. Just ask. Ask anybody. Ask me. It's fine. Okay. Thanks so much. Well, don't know. Let me see if there is questions. No worries. I hope so. Oh, good. Right. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, just how necessary have? Sorry. Audio connection. Well, let me stop sharing this presentation. Stream went okay. Stream stopped. Am I still there?
Yep. Still hearing you.
All right, good. So, Dave asked, how necessary is it to have a publisher? Now, this is a hard question, right? Because you can want a publisher for two reasons. And the first reason is because they have knowledge, expertise, or resources that you do not, right? And usually, those are related to releasing your game or to marketing. The second one is because you need money, right? Those are the two reasons to go with publishers. And you might not even need money. You might just prefer to let them take the risk instead of taking the risk yourself, right? Vlambeer, when we're doing Lifter Houses, we absolutely have the money to just self-publish it. But we prefer somebody else taking the risk in that, which Devolver Digital ended up doing that. Is it necessary to have a publisher? No. Does it help to have a publisher? Yeah, absolutely. Right. I'm enough of a romantic in the that I still really miss the days of like self-publishing and starting your company with just like two kids that have no idea what they're doing. The reality is that that still exists. It's just more and more rare. Right, because now you're competing with those two kids from 10 years ago, and they have an international studio. Well, not anymore. They had an international studio making these big games. So a publisher helps, which comes back to that pitching question, right? Like being able to pitch your game well, even if you don't want to, publish, is actually a really useful skill. And I think somebody put it in the other chat, but if you want to practice a pitch with me sometime, also like feel free, right? Just click the link to my Twitter. But is it necessary? No. Does it help? Absolutely. Is it healthy to let somebody else take the financial risk when you're already putting in the time? Yeah. Yeah, I think so. So if you can, at least give it a go. Like try, see what happens. Like maybe you'll pitch to 2 people and you'll find that everybody loves your game, and there's a lot of opportunity here. So yeah, no, I would definitely whatever you're making, unless there's a really strong reason not to go with a publisher, I definitely just pitch it, see what happens. Janus asks, are there any known notches or critical points specific to the games industry? I mean, so the most important thing I've learned over these past 10 years is that your hard skills aren't hard to learn, right? Your ability to program, your ability to draw, to make 3D models, that's not the important. Like, if I need to hire a programmer, I can hire 500, right? Like, I know 500, so that's not a problem. Finding a programmer that is easy to talk to, that is kind, that communicates well, that keeps track of what they're doing, that writes commit messages that everybody understands. Now, that's a lot harder. And out of those 500, there will probably be like 10 that hit all of those points, right? Those soft skills, the ability to work in a team, the ability to communicate, the ability to let people finish their thoughts, the ability to listen, not just speak, the ability to like give space to your team. Those abilities are much rarer, but those abilities, like, they are not the abilities that they teach you, right? They're not the abilities you can find on a YouTube video about 5 tips to make video games. But of all the things that I think matter in the games industry, that's the one that matters most. Like, if I talk to people hiring, that's the one that matters most. If I talk to publishers, they're not just looking for what are the technical parts of your pitch, right? They're looking at how you sell it, how you communicate about it. Like they're looking at your attitude towards business, right? I always say that the biggest mistake you can make in talking to a publisher is not asking too much money, it's asking too little money. I mean, think about it from that perspective, right? From the perspective of a publisher looking for a person that will take care of their team, it makes a lot of sense. Because if you ask for too much, we can just negotiate. That's fine. I'm not going to walk away from somebody because they ask for too much money. Try and negotiate it down, sure. If it's still too much, we just say, well, too bad, good luck. And we go on with our day. Nobody's going to hate you for asking too much money. But if you come to me and you say, like, oh, we need $20,000 to work with 20 people on a game for 3 years, I'm going to look at you and go, like, no, absolutely, that's impossible. And I'm not going to negotiate up for you. When you think about a lot of the problems in the games industry through the lens of people, right, rather than business, or people doing business, in this case, when you look through the lens of people doing business or people being people, a lot of the games industry makes a lot more sense, right? And a lot of the games industry is a lot more chaotic than a lot of people think. A lot of it is just people. It's just people that know each other. It's people that accidentally end up in a project. It's people making mistakes. It's people being good people. It's people being terrible people. A lot of what happens in the games industry is just that. It's just humans. Beyond that, don't overwork yourself. Validate everything. Test everything. Don't just assume things. And I think don't be afraid to reach out to anybody. Right? I remember when Ridiculous Fishing got cloned, probably the worst thing that happened to Vlambeer while it was around as a studio. I sent an email to CNN and I sent an email to the New York Times. And I did not believe either of those things were going to respond to me because it's CNN. They don't care about a video game about fishing with machine gun. I was on CNN like 2 days later, right? And I didn't expect the New York Times to run it. New York Times sent over a journalist to shadow us through the entire GDC that we were talking about the clone, including the talk that we gave about it. And we had a documentary crew following us at Polygon. We were not famous back then. I was not. I was not visible back then. I didn't have 100. What is it? 200,000 followers in the games industry. Like, no, I was a rookie. I was just starting out. I just emailed everybody, and people saw the story. People saw the person. They went, "Oh, okay, we'll give it a go." Right? I think those would probably be my gotchas, and like I said, none of them have really much to do with games. Most of them have to do with people. And Graham asks, is it necessary to have a standard company structure in order to succeed? I feel because the norm is just join a company and work 9 to 5, being an ND dev is confusing, unappealing, or scary. So no, the beauty of independent development is that nothing is necessary, right? The only thing that's necessary is that it works for you. Like it works for you and the people that you're working with. What I think things work out the way they are is because they work pretty well, right? That 9 to 5 day, it's not the best way of working, right? But the cadence of it, working 5 days, taking 2 days rest, for sure, but is between people need to work to make money and people need to rest to be able to work. And then overall the system is complete nonsense, but like that's not this talk at all. You want to do different, that's great, because there's always opportunity to improve on any system, on any default in our society. There's always room for improvement. So it doesn't come with a lot of guarantees because you're an entrepreneur, and being an entrepreneur means risk, right? The actual definition of an entrepreneur is somebody whose money and time are at risk is profit. So when you're thinking of indie dev, like I think the beauty is you can kind of do it whatever way you want, as long as you make the numbers work at the end, right? Like if at the end you can pay for your rent, you can pay for your food, you can pay for your team, or whatever it is that you need to pay for. If you can pay for all of those things, I don't care whether you work 1 hour per week on Wednesday from 2:30 to 3:30, or whether you work 40 hours a week, right? If you're going to end up working 60 hours a week, I'm going to recommend you make sure you get enough rest. But you don't have to work with people local. You can work remotely. You don't have to have phone calls with each other. You can work over chat. Vlambeer barely talk to each other. Me and my co-founder, I think we talk like 6 to 10 times a year, probably, running that studio. It was fine. We would have like tiny messages back and forth. I have this. I don't know if this is good, and one of us would just go like yes or no because, and that was it. But actually talking, rarely. Independent development it's risky because you're an entrepreneur. I do think, and I think a lot of local governments agree with me around the world, that digital culture or digital media, the part that game development falls under, is a tremendous opportunity, right? It's relatively cheap to get started. It's relatively cheap to participate. And if your economy is generally weaker than the major cities that game development take place in, which is almost everywhere on Earth, then the potential for profit is relatively high. A lot of people look at the industry and go like, oh, there's not a lot of hits, like a lot of people making games, not a lot of people making lots of money. That's true. But I don't think the goal should be to make lots of money. I think the goal should be making enough money to make your next game, right? And if that is your goal, actually, a lot of studios are doing quite fine, like slightly profitable, enough to keep going, enough to pay for rent, enough to pay for food. And I think that actually makes it really appealing, right? Like the appeal of independent development is anybody can learn to do it on a computer in their spare time, and almost anybody can turn it into a career that might pay for your life. The only thing you need to do is everything I just said, right? And then at the end of that, if you get everything right, being an entrepreneur means that if you get everything right, at the end you flip a coin. And you have to keep that coin in mind with every decision you make, right? I'm a consultant, right? Like I do consultancy at the moment. I do lots of things. I still make games, but I'm also a consultant. And the consultant thing, my rate is, I feel, I mean, it's fair, but I look at the number and I'm like, I don't understand why anybody is paying for that. And I realize now that people are paying those numbers because most consultants, right, in the market, they do a number of consultancy a month, right? They do like 10, they do like 15 calls. And those calls all need to be paid at such a level that multiplying the value by 10 or 15 is enough to live a life of, and also enough to like catch bad months, right? Like months where you get no new customers, months where you have no clients, months where things are slow. So those numbers end up getting inflated a lot, way beyond what I feel comfortable asking for indies. So I ended up making my consultancies cheap or free, depending on where you're from and what your situation is. For corporations, I still charge a big number, right? Like obviously, if I'm working with a big company, like I'll take their money. But for indies, I don't, right? Like I just want to help out. I think it's a really roundabout way of saying is there's no such thing really as a standard company structure. Like there is, the only thing that matters in running a business at the end is it adding something to the world, right? Something positive, preferably, and do the numbers add up? And if the numbers add up and the end result is a positive value, then it's fine. Do whatever you want. It's like it. There's literally no wrong way of doing it. So moving on to the Crash Course chat. I don't see any questions in the Crash Course chat. Okay. Right. College Jumio is asking, what would you think or recommend for a dev wanting to make a sell new game a month? Advertise in a specific way, make bundles. So my rule with any of this is that the most valuable thing you can earn is not $1, but a person's interest, right? Because that person's interest might translate to $1, it might translate to 10 times $1, it might translate to whatever. But the most important thing is a person's interest, right? So if I were making a game a month, my goal would be to get more people to play / donate / pay for the game every month, to get people to talk more about the games every month. So I would probably release it as a series. I would probably give it a pretty cheesy name. I'd probably put my own name in the title. Like I don't know if you would call it College Jumio Presents, but I would make something that people can attach to, something that is bigger than the game itself, because 1 month is not enough to run a marketing campaign. But it is more than Series Calyx, that works. It's more than enough to get people interested in the brand, right? The overarching brand. Vlambeer started that way as well. We never promoted our games. We always promoted Vlambeer as a brand because our games, they were too fast in development to actually market them well. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. Try to aim just every time, aim for getting one more person interested in your games and talking about them. Just Join asks, what is the best advice you would give to an indie with little to no money about how to go about marketing, right? So the trick about marketing is that there's 3 types of marketing. There's good marketing, there's bad marketing, and there's terrible marketing. Terrible marketing only really exists if it damages people's faith in you, right? People's trust in you. Which can happen in multiple ways, right? You can be a jerk online. You can not keep to your promises. You can piss off people or say something controversial. All of those things can be terrible marketing, right? Now, the beauty of marketing is that anything that isn't terrible marketing is safe. Because if you do bad marketing, the beauty of it is that it won't work. It won't go anywhere. And if it doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't matter that it's bad because nobody will see it, nobody will care, nobody will remember. Right? So the thing with marketing, I think a lot of people treat it like, oh, we have to get this perfect before we start talking about it. Do you know how I develop a lot of my pitches for my games? Like a lot of the one sentence pitch for my games. I would go to a PAX or I would go on Twitter and I would just start using it. And I would just see what people say, right? Like when they see the game, they go like, "Oh yeah, the machine gun fishing game." I'd be like, "Oh, yeah, the machine gun fishing is pretty good. Oh, it's nice, right?" Sometimes your own pitch is the best one. Sometimes somebody else pitches your game better than you, and the only way to really figure that out is just start going, get as much attention, and then go from there, right? If it's bad marketing, nobody will notice. If it's good marketing, then whoever notices is aboard, right? So don't treat your marketing as something you have to get right straight away. Start with plenty of time left, 6 months, 3 months at the minimum. 6 months is a pretty good start. And spend that time just trying stuff. And if things work, do more of that and less of the other stuff. Hope that answers your question. Guru Makesi asks, what are your thoughts on research cycles and development and how to pitch funding for that? When it comes to research, like obviously it's a very separate market from business to consumer work. You're effectively doing business to business or grant work. If you're doing grant work, the main thing you have to think about is what value are you generating, right? And for a lot of research, it means having to define hypothesis, benefit of study, a way of testing or measuring your results. Every time that I've worked around researching games or with researching games, it seemed really involved, right? The main thing for funding is you need to reach out to whoever might be interested in the outcome of your work, which depending on what you're making is going to be very different, right? I had a consultancy with somebody who made a game about who is doing research on the interaction between a certain book and an app and what that does for people's awareness of that book. And that means that really only book publishers would be interested in funding that kind of research. So they had a hard time getting funding. This turns out a lot of book publishers don't really do funding, but or research funding. But if you're looking at something that looks at like society, it looks at culture, it looks at how people talk, how people interact. Governments tend to have a space for those kind of grants. Universities tend to have research for those kind of grants. Like see what umbrella it might fall under, and then go from there. Saley asks, when my prototype vertical slice is ready to be shown, what's the next step if you want to get funding? Well, that would be your pitch, right? It will be your pitch deck. Your pitch deck is effectively creating the sales advertisement for your work. And usually it will include what the game is, why anybody would care, and what you need to make it, right? I do a talk about pitching. I think it's called 3 sentences or less. You can look it up online. I know Chris Wolf did a good talk on pitch decks as well. And there's also a website that just shows you a number of examples of pitch decks. I don't know if anybody has the link available, but if they do, if they don't, I can find it for you a little bit later. And that's fine. So yeah, pitch deck is next, and then after pitch deck, it's reach out to publishers. Part of your pitch deck is obviously calculating your budget, calculating the resources required. So it's not an easy one. It's not an easy question. It's not a question that I have time to answer, sadly. But I hope that answer gives you direction enough to figure things out. If not, go to my Twitter, hit the schedule a call thing, and schedule a call with me, and we'll talk about it a bit more. Glenn asks, I want to fund an Android game via Patreon. Have any suggestions on how to do this without breaking Google Play Store's rules? Well, this is a complicated question because all of those things are a little bit in flux right now, right? The biggest thing is you're not allowed on the platform easily if you're selling something that does not give a cut to the platform. Which does mean that if your games are not technically what people are getting for the Patreon, that it is fine. This is the way that I have found that most people get around that rule is they make sure that the game or the app is not the product that is actually created. The product might be development videos or diary or blog posts or whatever, right? But that seems to be the workaround that I've seen that has worked so far. I will say these rules are in flux, right? Like these things are changing right now as we're speaking. They're in court. Epic versus Apple, Google versus Epic. We don't know how those things are going to change. So the answer that I'm giving you now might be changed in like 2 weeks, right? Calix, yes, that is the one. A very useful page that Calix just put in chat. Just a few examples of good pitch decks. And Sorbu actually asks, what if indies actually do have money to spare on marketing? What would be the best way to use it nowadays, assuming there's no publisher responsible for it and free marketing possibilities are covered already? I have found that the three things that are most useful, one of them is unavailable right now because it's expos, right? Like expos are incredibly useful. They're not only an opportunity to reach people, they're also an opportunity to play test. They're an opportunity to hear people talk about your game. They're an opportunity to network. They are an incredibly powerful tool. They're also entirely non-existent at the moment. So that's a little hard. The second one, and I hate it, is Facebook. Facebook is as successful as it is because it is so good at extracting all your personal data, making a model of you, and figuring out what you're interested in, that it's just disgustingly good at what it does. It's as soon as you've been on the advertisement side on the Facebook platform, you realize how scary it is. But yeah, Facebook, yeah, Instagram, all of those, the Facebook platforms effectively are incredibly useful because they allow you to target very precisely. And because you can target so precisely, you can A/B test, right? It's easier to A/B test. It's easier to see how different things affect people's response. The final one, Twitter is also okay. It's less effective. The only reason I would use Twitter is if I really quickly wanted to reach a lot of people, right? It has lower conversion than Facebook in our experience. and it's a little more expensive than Facebook in our experience. But yeah, Facebook is super effective. The final one is to temporarily work with a PR agency during major press pushes, right? To hire their services and access to their press list at the point it matters most, like close to release. Depending on how much money you have, those three options might be available. So that's probably what I would do. What you have to realize about publishers nowadays is there's really not such a thing as a publisher anymore. I mean, there's a few, but Devolver Digital, it's not really a publisher. It's more of a network, right? Devolver has a few people that work for them. None of them are in marketing. None of them are in publishing. None of them are in release management. They're managers. They're cool people. I like them a lot. They have a good eye for games, but they're decision makers. And the people that work with them are usually developer relations people that can keep talking to developers or find interesting games. And then beyond that, their PR is done by an external PR agency, right? Or two even nowadays. Their booths are built by an external booth agency. Their marketing is done by an external marketing agency. Their release management is done by an external release agency. Their porting is done by an external port agency. They just connect you with all of those, and they have priority access to those. And they have a few people aboard that are useful. Like they have a trader person that's just fully theirs nowadays. But they're not technically with Devolver. They're kind of like external partners that Devolver works with. So yeah, a lot of this, you can just hire those services yourself if you have the money. So if you need access to good marketing, you can just hire a marketing agency, right? If you have that money, cool, go for it. It also saves you having to give a cut off your game on the other end. So if you're expecting that you're going to make quite a bit of money off something, sometimes not giving up a 30% cut and just finding a way to invest in it yourself, if you're certain, is actually a pretty good way of doing it. But as always, you're an entrepreneur. In the end, the risk is yours, right? It's all you. You're flipping the coin at the end. Good. I think that was it. I think that was the questions. Awesome. It was an absolute joy being here. Thank you so much for the questions. Those were fun questions. I will say, if you have any questions you didn't feel like asking here because, not public information or uncomfortable talking about things in public, or just couldn't come up with a question, and in like 10 minutes you're like, oh, I should have asked that. Reach out to me on Twitter. I am THA_Rami on Twitter. You can DM me. My DMs are open. Feel free to ask anything in DMs. I usually reply within 3 to 5 days. If I do not, please just send it again. I get so many messages that sometimes something just falls through the cracks, right? And it's not personal. Please follow up with me. If not, if it doesn't work in DMs, use that link that somebody posted earlier. I think it was Calix, but whoever it was that posted it, that pinned tweet, you can just book a 20-minute consultancy call for free, the emergent territory one. Feel free to use that. The emergent territory free one. Oh, it was Glenn. Well, now it's also you. So Glenn and Calix, thanks for posting that. In 20 minutes, we can go over your pitch, we can go over your problem and just chat for a bit. That is absolutely fine. Please do that. And finally, you can reach out via email, info@ramiismail.com. If you have a larger thing, my email is probably the thing that I try to keep track of most, but it's also the thing I get most messages on. So again, it might take a while for me to reach out. If I do not, please follow up. It's okay. Don't worry about it. This goes for everything, by the way. You email a publisher, you don't get a response, follow up. Give them a week. If they don't respond within a week, send an email. And the email just kind of goes like, hey, just checking in. So is everything okay? Do you need more information? Can we help with anything? Let's say like, oh no, check back with us in 2 weeks, or no, we'll email you. Sure, like check again in 2 weeks, right? Like it's okay to remind people of things. Just don't be overbearing, but like checking once a week is generally fine, unless it feels like things are slow. If somebody says like it's going to take 3 weeks, don't email them after 1 week. But if people are late with something, do follow up. That includes me, because I'm just human and I miss things sometimes or forget things. So do follow up. Awesome. Starjay, yeah, if you have a build of your game, when you book the phone call, you can actually add a link to your game, and I will give it a go. Awesome. Yeah, Glenn and the entire developer society. Thank you so much for organizing this and for having me here. It was an absolute pleasure.
And thank you for making the time. It was great having you. I think everyone got a lot of value from this. So I'm safe to say that the first crash course was a success, and looking forward to organizing the next one and the next one and the next one. So yeah, guys, thanks for showing up. Thanks for the very, very thought-provoking questions. And yeah, I'll be sending out a link just to gather up some trailing comments on the session. And I'll keep you guys posted on the next one.
Have a good one.
Alright. Alright, guys, that's it. Later. Thank you.